Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 30th Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. My name is Maja Changseliani. I'm Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education here at the University of Oxford. These seminars are jointly organized by the Department of Education and St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. Before introducing our speaker today, let me attend to a few administrative points. As you might have noticed, this seminar is being recorded and we will post it on the Department of Education's YouTube channel in due course. I would like to ask you to keep yourself muted, please, throughout the webinar, unless you have been invited to speak. If you would like to speak, if you want to share your comment or ask a question, please put your question or comment in the chat box of the Zoom. I will select your questions and comments after the talk has finished and will invite you to share your comment or question with the speaker. Excuse me, I'm trying to also let people in. So when I invite you, can you please unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and share your question or comment. Now, let me introduce our speaker, Professor Gustavo Fischman. Gustavo Fischman is Professor of Education Policy and Comparative Education at the Arizona State University. He is also Director of Scholarly Communication at Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College. His research focuses on scholarly communications, global citizenship education, and sustainability, as many of you in the audience may know already. Gustavo Fischman contributes to understanding and improving the processes of knowledge production and exchange between scholars, educators, activists, practitioners, administrators, media workers, policymakers, and the broad public. Currently, he is working on projects related to the understanding of how universities respond to global sustainability challenges. He also works on understanding the possibilities and problems of using open science models of inquiry and assessment. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our speaker who will be talking about using, misusing, and abusing education research journals. Gustavo, floor is yours.
Thank you, Maya, and thanks for inviting me and the opportunity to share ideas with this group. I'm going to share the screen. So before moving forward, I want to make two considerations. The first one is that most of the data, experiences, and proposals that I will be sharing are very much influenced by my experience as a first-generation university graduate immigrant from Argentina, living in between the US and Brazil and doing research in the Americas. So what I'm trying to say is, unfortunately, I'm not going to give you much details about ideas based on the experience of education journals in the UK, because I haven't explored those in as much detail as the ones in the Americans. In short, context matters, something that you all know, but I want to make that very explicit. And the second consideration is I'm not going to be presenting things that are new, that you haven't heard before, in terms of this is the most original analysis of education research journals, but I hope that is a humble contribution. So during the last 10 years, I've been studying how highly ranked journals and colleges of education in the Americas are using this idea of impact. And you are well aware of the impact agenda and the role of publications and particular citations have in shaping our work. And then important consideration, I'm not against counting things. I'm not against counting publications and citations as relevant indicators of something. I'm going to try to introduce some nuances about what this impact agenda is, creating a context that produces certain uses and some abuses of education journals. The second is that this impact agenda is not about education or is not exclusive to our field. It is widespread and is creating some conditions that are generating a sense of mistrust in science, and that is particularly important in our field. One of the things that I find very, very interesting is when we conducted these studies about how influential faculties, colleges of education are reacting, are navigating this crisis, we asked faculty, so how is this happening? Why are we having this sense of constant stress? You know, we talked to faculty, and faculty were very stressful, and they generally say that somebody on the top, the administrator, the National Science Foundation, the National Councils for Research, were to blame for this impact agenda. So it's that somebody else. We have nothing to do with that. And I was, you know, okay, yeah, it's possible that something like that is happening, but I think it's an explanation that is insufficient. Number one, it's insufficient because, you know, countries as different from the US, Canada, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina are using very similar systems, and they have very, very different models for funding universities, for encouraging types of research, for, you know, assessing the impact of research. So I don't think that blaming the powerful ministries of science and technology is an enough reason. The second is that using publications to assess our research, our influence, our impact, is being, you know, used just in the last 30 years or 40 years. It's kind of a new use of journals in the very long history of journals. Many of you may know that, you know, we have journals at least for 350 years. So the history of the journal as a means of contributing to the production and dissemination of scientific knowledge is a, you know, centenary tradition. But the use of the journal to assess the impact of individual, I'm talking the use of the journal, not the articles, is relatively new. And, you know, why all these reasons, you know, encourage me to keep digging and doing several different research projects, looking at how the journals are being used in our field, particularly in our field. So one important thing is that the field has changed. Sorry. Oh, the field has changed substantially in the last 40 years. Number one, the use of the journals in this constant classification of countries, programs, and so on is relatively new. The amount of money that we are spending in the journals is pretty substantial. The number of publications is pretty substantial, and the newest, or in these developments in the last 4 years, has been the development of a ton of different tools to measure journals, citations, productivity, influence, things that, you know, before were not in the culture of assessing educational research. So, reaching this point, I want to make 2 clarifications. I'm doing perspectives, I'm analyzing perspectives. I'm not making predictions about the future of the journals, yes, or the future of the research articles. So these are my perspectives based on my research. I'm not predicting what's going to happen because the field is very fluid right now. And please use with reflection. So what's the first thing that we discover in our research of highly influential journals? That the idea of the publish or perish is not new. It has been with us for a long, long time. But what has changed tremendously is the size. So the number of students that are now in universities, the number of researchers that are now in universities is at a scale that was not imagined in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. So it's not only the size, the number of the students, but that the number of students increase, and they are coming from a very different background from traditional students in the universities. So I'm a first generation in university in my family, and it's not that I'm smarter than my brothers or my nephews or my nieces or my cousins. It's just that I was born in a particular moment in Argentina when it was feasible to go to the university and to work and to sustain. That is a condition that a few years earlier and a few years later was impossible for my brothers and my nephews, cousins, and so on. So it's not just, and this is important, that first generation people that were not accustomed, used to, having discussions about the value of science or how to publish and so on, it matters. It matters a lot. Then the other thing that is absolutely crucial is that we are spending a lot of money in science and development, and the more money we spend on research and development is also attracting more scrutiny and more demands for accountability. I was reading very recently that in the case of the English system, the British system of assessment, the REF, doubled the size to £471 million for the 2021 exercise. And that's a significant amount of money that attracts a lot of scrutiny. It's not only that we are spending a lot of money, but we are publishing and spending a lot of money on the production of the journals and the articles. I'm not going to get into the criticism of the 5 big publishing houses in Europe and how much profit they are making based on our free labor. In many cases, I'm assuming that but again, number of publications and the cost of the publications is pretty significant. The criticisms to the Plan S in Europe, or the criticisms to subsidies in China or in Africa or in the Americas is also well known. Okay, so with all these conditions, we were asking faculty in these colleges how they perceive journals and their function in the profession. And the image that we were using images, and we were asking in interviews and surveys, people say this is a constant race where there is one winner, and then it doesn't matter if you are second, third, or fourth, there is just one winner. And that was the reference that people say as an increasingly stressful profession, and with lots of people saying, if this continues, I will abandon the profession. So we say, okay, what else matters in our profession? And basically it was unanimous that publications were the most significant indicator of impact, and that, the competition, we didn't find colleges or faculty that were experimenting with collaborative models for producing research, but we are aware that some places are moving into that direction. But in the research, these colleges and colleagues were saying, well, publications. The second was the amount of funding that was related to the publications. The more publications you have, the more likely you were going to get funding from science councils and agencies. And the newest, that was when we started 10 years ago, awards were relevant, but in the last few years, the number of awards has exploded and it became very, very significant. So the advantage of these three indicators of impact is that they're easy. They're easy to count, are easy to find supposedly neutral objective measures of associated to these ones. And the fourth one is influence. And that was the one that created more debates, controversies, because the different colleges use, the first three as proxies for influence, but the one that they say matter in promotions was influence. And the influence was in general associated to, how many publications in high impact journals, how much money did you get, and how many awards did you get. So influence is very elusive, but it depends on the previous three. Good news for the field is that if this model that we are using had the goal of producing more research in education, definitely we are very successful. We are publishing a lot more articles. We are publishing a lot more journals. There is no doubt that if the system or this model had as a goal to produce more education research, we are producing more education research as measured by the number of articles. And if I use Scopus as the intermediate between Web of Science and Google Scholar. And this is before the explosion of the Frontiers journals and the MDPI journals that are now some of the most influential in the field. So we are publishing a lot more. That's good. We are publishing a lot more, and our field, in some countries, education is classified as humanities. In other countries, are natural sciences. There is some indications that we are also being cited more. But we are cited more without breaking with the old Pareto rule. The old Pareto rule of the 20% of the members of the field produce 80% of the results. So we are publishing a lot more. Our 20% of highly influential or highly cited researchers is bigger than 20 years ago. But there are still 80% of the researchers in the field that are publishing, but they get very little citations. And if you don't publish in English, the situation is a lot more complicated. So I do a lot of research in Latin America with colleagues publishing in Spanish and Portuguese, and the situation for them is really a lot more challenging, because if you publish in Spanish and Portuguese, the chances of your work to be cited, even if you work in a highly influential university as the University of Sao Paulo or the National University in Mexico or Buenos Aires, your chances of being cited are smaller than if you publish the same article in English. that is creating a lot of incentives to, publish in Spanish and then create an alternative version in English that you have to spend a lot of money for the translation. Those articles translated tend to have very little chances to be published in highly influential journals, so you end up working with not that, not that reputable journals. So the situation of we are publishing more in more journals, yes, that is good, but we couldn't, no, it's not our field alone. Breaking the Pareto law seems still very, very hard. What we are seeing is that a movement that started 20 years ago, but now is pretty prevalent, of giving a lot of awards for best article, awards for best journals. We are giving awards for, a significant increase of awards in education research. Looking at the 7 research organizations in North America, we got an interesting, situation that people still give preference to solo author papers, although in these education research journals from the Americas, the co-authorship covers 85% of all the articles published. But there is a preference for awards, but so individually author articles that we talked to some of the reviewers and they said, well, it looks more scientific or within the tradition. I don't think that is a very good relevant criteria, but we went to the data again, and it's not only that solo author papers get better chances to get awards, but also, that if you are white and you are male, you have better chances of receiving one of these awards. So the field is publishing more. It gets a more diverse body of contributors. We are getting more recognitions. We have not breaking the Pareto law, and we are not overcoming the old biases and preferences for certain groups. So we still have a lot of work to do there. So with the same group of people, we asked the questions, what's your perception of the research published in education journals? And we asked faculty, so members of the field, and we also asked teachers and principals in public schools. We didn't incorporate private schools, so this is a limitation of the research. And so in both cases, the perspective is not very positive. Different reasons, but very similar about that, we are not publishing very relevant work. Yes, there were exceptions. There were always people that said, well, the work of such and such was important. But when they look at the field in general, these are the words that define our publications. And the significant difference is that people were talking a lot about the gap, the gap between what we publish and how it's used, the gap between the professionals in the field and the researchers in the field. So we have a big problem there, I think. So my sense with the journals is that the big significant change was the use of the journal for managerial purposes to assess our contributions. The interesting part is that the journal per se now is an artifact of tradition, because very few people and we talk to graduate students and scholars, like, do you subscribe to journals? As you know, I was told when I started my PhD 30 years ago, I was like, you have to subscribe. That was kind of the command of my faculty at UCLA, where I studied. It's like we were a group of 12 students in social sciences and comparative education, and they give us a list of 50 journals and say, pick 6 to 10 based on your budget and read every single article in these journals. So the idea was to learn the culture of the journal and so on. Our students today, they don't subscribe to journals. Nobody reads a journal. People read articles. So the unit of analysis is the article, not the journal. However, in these colleges, the unit of analysis was the journal, not the article. People use the assumed prestige of the journal and the words associated to a journal as indicators of the quality of the research, which is an indirect measure, and it is an indirect measure of quality. I'm not saying that it's irrelevant. It is relevant, but it's very different from how we are using the research published. We don't read journals, we read articles. We do searches. We ask, you know, in one of our surveys, how do you engage in research in conducting, you know, a lead review? Do you filter by fill the blank? And, you know, there was less than 2% of the people that search by journals as a filter. They search by keywords, and eventually they pay attention to, oh, this is a very good journal, this is not such a good journal, but people look for the article based on keywords. When in the past, going to the journal first seems to be the norm. So we have this combination of different practices about how to use the journals that are creating really interesting problems. Okay, so the system for assessing educational research is using the quality of the journals, not because we are crazy. It's just, this is a very simple and economical system for assessing something that we call impact. And this is, you know, pretty good for the rankings, for indirect ideas of impact and prestige and influence, but it's not very good at generating trust in our educational research and something that I call the usability of educational research. And I don't want to make this as, you know, some people only are concerned with rankings and some people are only concerned with trust. We are one. I'm as concerned with the rankings of my college and the ranking of the journals and the citations of my article as I'm concerned with the trust that I can generate with the research, the trust, the relationships that I can engage to generate trust. Trust is not a given. Maya, I can stop here or I can go if you...
See for another 5 minutes or so, and meanwhile,
Okay,
I would
good.
encourage the audience to start sharing their questions.
Good. So, very fast. We need to change this. We need to, and the field is changing tremendously. But I think that we need to change, and as a field, we need to start working in more collaborations. So for me, the starting point is to recognize that what we do is very difficult. To do educational research that matters is difficult and it's expensive. and it requires collaboration, and it requires teams. It requires interdisciplinary perspectives. It's not cheap. And in the Americas, the number of people that get funding that could be considered enough, adequate, vis-a-vis the problems that they are trying to address is very small. In some countries, like in the US, only 30% of the scholars in the field get funding that is adequate to do adequate to the research problem that they are trying to work. In countries like Argentina or Chile or Brazil, that number is really, really small, and is very unstable. That's different also, because in the US at least, and in Canada, you have certain levels of predictability because science policy is a state policy and it doesn't change. Well, it may change significantly after 2024, but in other countries, it changes all the time. So starting point, we have to keep fighting for the recognition of education research as science, and as science that requires adequate funding. The second point is I really don't think that we need to consider this as a zero-sum game that we always oppose quantity with quality, innovation against stability, private benefits versus public benefits, global, local, scientific, pedagogical. Our journals, our research is constantly in tension. It's, sometimes we will, make a more direct contribution to the field, to the teaching, to the practice, sometimes to the concepts and the theory. It's not one or the other. We can do both, particularly because in our field, and this is very important for me, the scientific impact or the scholarly or disciplinary impact will reach the professionals. What is not going to happen is that it's going to happen in simultaneous. So, think about the idea of diversity or inclusion of students. Those were themes or intersectionality, things that we talked 30, 40 years ago, and it took, decades until those ideas became practices in elementary schools or in NGOs or international organizations. It took years. However, we are using the journals to assess our impact year by year. And that is really unfair. And it doesn't really provide us with good indicators or sense of what's the relevance of the research published and used. So I'm going to stop there because I want to hear your questions, but I think that there are very interesting examples of more collaborative, interdisciplinary, and usable research published in journals. And usable, it doesn't mean practical. Usable means being accessible and engageable. So there are things that we can do with the journals that will make them more usable. That involves adequate funding, adequate recognition of the work of editors, adequate recognition of the work of the reviewers, but it's not practical. It's not a direct measure of practicality. It's something that, okay, once it's published, can be engaged by multiple users. And I don't want to use the word stakeholders, but that is what in the field is being used. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now and open to questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gustavo, for an excellent presentation, really thought-provoking. I'm sure the participants here will have questions and comments, and I would like to encourage everyone to just give an indication if you want to speak in the chat so that I invite you to speak. And perhaps I could start. I wrote down a few questions while you were speaking. So basically, you started with impact, and while the current measures of impact, we all agree, quantitative measures are not very useful for anyone, probably, except some of the government funders maybe, or bureaucrats who want to quickly assess impact based on the journal impact factor or citations and so on and so forth. But lots of universities around the world, including Oxford, try to avoid such entirely quantitative measurements of impact. So what are your views? How can we, assuming that we do not use those superficial quantitative indicators, what would be the best ways of judging the true value of research in our field, in education? I think this question could be quite different in different fields. I recently completed a review of a new book that came out by Justin Powell and David Baker about global mega science, and it's about science, okay? So it's a very different, about STEM subjects, so very different area, very different assumptions there and measurement of impact, etc. But in our field, what do you think would be most appropriate ways of measuring the value, the impact, and what are some of the most important steps we can take to make research more accessible and trustworthy? Because you mentioned accessibility, and I think in my view, only accessible research can become impactful. But it will be good to hear more from you. What do you think could be actually the ways in which we can address this?
Well, the first thing I want to say, I'm going to reverse the order of my answers, and let's start with access. Access and open access, diamond style, not open access with article processing charges, I think is something that we need to keep fighting for. And with this consideration, science has been subsidized for hundreds of years. Since we have, this field that we call science, has been subsidized. Science associated to or demanding that scientists will be able to self-fund their project, has never happened. So if we subsidize science, why not subsidizing adequately the access to that science? We are spending 99% of our budgets in producing the knowledge and very little in making that science trustworthy and accessible. And these two things will go together. If it's not accessible, it's not going to be trustworthy. So that's a first thing. We need to keep talking about how to make our research more accessible. The second is that to make something accessible needs to address gaps. And one gap is in the training. So we are trained to produce research. We haven't gotten the training to make our research accessible to multiple potential users. And that is not valued. So perhaps the way of doing that is, and we tried that, and I have to say in quite successful ways, creating units of knowledge mobilization at the institutional level, not at the individual, the idea of knowledge mobilization as an individual responsibility, that's something that will add more work to our already very full work demands. So, but imagine that Oxford or wherever, any other university will have within each college or within each academic unit an adequate budget for knowledge mobilization at the institutional level that serves the faculty. Not all faculty finish the projects at the same time. Not all faculty have the same type of potential users. And a team of knowledge mobilization could help with making that more accessible in the forms of translation to, the translation from the language to the translation to the different contexts, to the production of podcasts, to the allocation of time to identify relevant users. So I'm going to give you this as an example. I led the knowledge mobilization unit of our college for a few years, and we have different actions. But one of the most effective actions was for the scholars that were working on issues that impacted classroom activities, teaching science or inclusion of kids with special needs and so on. One of the most effective things that we did is to give money to invite teachers and principals to have lunch or to have a coffee or tea with the researchers and asking questions, building trust. And that was something that started to transfer in the perspective of those professionals of saying, okay, yes, I use research, but I only use research when it's recommended by somebody that I trust. And that is a finding that we know is long-standing in our field. But if our colleges don't give us any opportunity to develop relationships that are trustworthy with other people, people are not going to go and read our journals. The other thing that we did is we created different versions of the same research without punishing the scholars for having multiple versions of the same, because the multiple versions were for different audiences. And we started to reward professional development activities based on research, because we make this very strange distinction. This is service, this is research, and this is teaching. Well, supposedly our teaching has to be informed by our research, and the service the same. But we only give value to the research part, but not how you use your research in teaching and service. We started to value those things. It created a very different environment, less competition among scholars, among colleagues. And that produced more usable, engageable, and in a way, impactful research. And we changed the unit of time. Instead of measuring everything year by year, we said, okay, so what's your plan for the next 3 to 5 years? Give us indicators of how you are engaging. Show us how this idea travel. Yes, citations matter. The type of journal that you publish matter. But in my case, I do research in Latin America, so I have to publish. I decide to publish in Spanish and Portuguese, as well as in English. So I have to do it in the 3 languages. And people know, okay, so the publications in Spanish and Portuguese are not going to get that many citations. But are they going to be used in teacher education programs? Oh, yes. So what type of evidence you can provide for that? So it's a matter of looking at, yes, accounting, be responsible, use quantitative metrics when they are available, and use qualitative indicators when you cannot have the other ones, because you need to integrate both. So that's the thing. And to the first one, if you are not aware of the DORA declaration, please go and look at the Declaration of Research Assessment San Francisco. The latest one is the Declaration of Barcelona. We have plenty of alternative ways of assessing the quality, being responsible to the authorities that are funding our research, but also to the public. The public demands more if I don't like the word, but they demand to know how they are spending the money in our research. And if our research is not engageable, is not going to satisfy that demand of accountability. Sorry for the longer answer.
Thank you. Excellent. Especially, I liked your example of using your research in Latin America in teacher education programs. I think that's one of the biggest impacts that educational research can have, since education as field probably started as teacher education largely in many institutions. So impacting future teachers, of course, is one of the largest impacts that we can have.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention that we look at the syllabi in the teacher education programs. Usually these influential colleges have the graduate studies and then the teacher ed program separated. We canvass all the syllabi from the college and looking for how much of the literature produced by us, the researchers, was in the teacher education programs. And it was it was horrible because it was minimal. So within the same institution, people don't use the research produced in the same institution in the teacher education programs. I was like, okay.
Your teacher's college at Arizona State University.
And we did it in 6 different institutions.
Okay.
And it's like, okay, you have the expert in writing and in the teacher ed program, in the literacy class for writing, you are not using the work of why not? And they were using materials, that are produced. It was very ironic. Some of the ideas were the ideas of the scholars in the college, but they were adapted into textbooks by commercial publishers without attribution to the original scholar. So that is one of the things that we know is happening quite a lot. Our research reaches teachers, but not directly by us, because our contribution is made available publicly. Then somebody else could take the idea, package it in the adequate form, and reaching hundreds of thousands of teachers. That is why an office of knowledge mobilization should be doing, not the individual researcher. This is very, very important. I don't want to add more things to our busy lives, but the institution should encourage collaboration, interdisciplinarism, and making accessible and engageable. It's not just marketing. It's not just, let me show how influential we are. It's working with and in collaboration. Knowledge mobilization starts with the users in the field, not just among scholars. If our conversation is among just scholars, we are not going to address the problems.
Thoughts. Arifa Gumus Sari says that their question was already addressed. Thank you, Gustavo, for addressing the question without hearing it. Jorge Delgado, Jorge, would you like to come in? I think your question was addressed also, more or less, but if you want to come in and say hello at least, that will be great.
Hello, Maya, Gustavo. Thank you very much.
Jorge.
I haven't seen you in a while, Gustavo. How are you? So yes, my question, I'm lately worried about that we are taking a lot of things for granted. I did my doctoral dissertation on precisely on academic journals, and I worked with Gustavo. Actually, Gustavo was in my dissertation committee. So, but currently, I'm worried about what is behind the whole trend of publication, journals, precisely when you see that incredible growth publications. One of my questions is usually who reads and who reaches the research. And so my question, probably a little philosophical, is so if we should, for Gustavo, is if we should go back and reflect a little bit more on the ways we communicate research results. If it's the model of lengthy articles, is the model of academic journals, and who should research reach? What do you think?
Thank you, Jorge. Very relevant question. Another of the research projects that we have was to look at who became influential in the field. Because I was particularly concerned with the notion of the books are useless, and this shift in the field that, you know, many of these influential colleges started to mandate that the dissertations have to be constructed as 3 publishable articles. And we look at a comparison of the influential scholars, looking at the list of the ARA fellows, the Rick Hess influential fellows, the National Academy of Education fellows, and see, okay, so looking at their publications and what other fellows say is the most influential work of, you know, their colleagues. And the interesting finding is, if you want to be influential in the US, this is just the US, I don't go beyond the US, the data is just the US. All the influential scholars, their most cited work and the work that is recognized by professionals in their field are their books, not the articles. Everybody have books and articles, but, you know, Linda Darling Hammond, Diane Ravitch, Martin Carnot, Hank Levin, you know, Pasi Salver, their books is what construct their influence and their prestige. And their books are the ones that reaches schools and teachers and principals and policymakers and the media. You know, people don't comment on articles, people comment on books. But we are, you know, having this mandate for graduate students, just write articles. Well, let's consider, is the article always the adequate vehicle to communicate research? Well, in many cases, the answer is yes. But in terms of developing a body of work that can be communicated to multiple audiences, sometimes the article is not the best way of doing that, and a short book could do it, or a long book. I don't know. It depends of the problem. But so one of the things that we know is that the book is in our field. In the US, the book in education is still very, very relevant. But we are discouraging the production of books by the young generation. So books are now just for full professors. So we are doing something that empirically we couldn't find we cannot corroborate that the research article is the best way for engaging with our research. It is important, yes, but the book still matters. The same with lectures. So another thing that is absolutely impossible to do in many universities, faculty that produce research that is outside the field, or that needs to be engaged by principals or policymakers. When faculty requested money to attend those meetings, in many cases, that money was denied because it wasn't field specific. I says, well, if you want that research to be engaged, you need to subsidize the communication between the scholar and possible users in the field. Not just to present. It's like they need to be able to go and engage in conversations. So this is another small thing that we could use. It's like, if we want our research to be engageable, we need to go to other places. If the only place I go is the British Association or the American Association or the European, it's like, how what's the miracle that is going to make my research engageable by others if I don't go and talk to others?
Very good points. Thank you so much. And I will invite the last question from David Mills. Please, David.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Gustavo. Thank you, Maya. Really enjoyed that. A quick question really about your work, Gustavo, in Latin America. And I know you've worked with several colleagues who've written about the Latin American research ecosystem. So what's your sense of whether that offers us a vision of the future? I know the UNESCO Open Science Principles, I think, were partly written by Fernanda Bagel, and they seem to offer a vision of a open, not-for-profit research infrastructure. There's lots of ways in which we've got lots to learn from that well-resourced sort of model from America and Redelic and the funding of UNAM and so on. But it runs up against a very different model, which is much more profit-oriented in the global north, if you want to call it that. Which one is going to win out?
Okay. Again, I cannot predict. I see the tendency. Right now, the situation in Latin America is that none of those models will win because there is a disinvestment in science in general. So with disinvestment, there is no profit to be made. There is supposedly savings. In the US and in Europe, I would say this is pretty much in our hands, in the sense of, the scientific community, I think, is more aware. There is more debate. There is more people. It's like when we started, with these things 30 years ago, it's like people is like, what are you talking about? It's like, this is nonsense. Yes, of course, the journal has to generate money. It's like, okay, hold on. To generate money for what? To the support of the association. But is that more important than contributing to the science, to contributing to their pedagogical formation? It's like, where do you put the emphasis? Because to do science requires money, period. So I don't argue with that, but let's talk about priorities and how do we balance this unstable situation. I think that the UNESCO proposal for open science is getting some traction. It's been discussed, it's more discussed. There is more enthusiasm in the, for lack of a better notion, the global South is embracing the UNESCO Open Science, the Barcelona Declaration, DORA, than what I'm aware of in the US and Europe. But for example, Canada is moving towards that direction without changing everything. But the fund, for example, in Canada, the SHERP, the research funding agency, is incorporating dimensions of knowledge mobilization as part of the criteria for assessing the relevance of a research project in the future. It's like, okay, so but we will talk about this 5 years from now. There is more openness. In Europe, the Plan S is generating so much profit. But I think that, the scholars, I haven't met a lot of scientists in Europe, and I don't interact with a lot of them all the time, but that says, oh, the Plan S is absolutely spectacular. We should expand. It's like people are unhappy. Society is unhappy because we are spending a lot more money. Scholars are unhappy because they are spending more money in things that they don't really care and they feel overstressed and overworked. The governments are unhappy because they're spending more money. So other than the 5 big publishers, who is happy with this model? So that gives me a sense that it's possible that we will move towards a more balanced. And I'm not against publishers have a function, but I think that we need to start, understanding that the subsidy for science needs to subsidy the science and the usability, not just, the very little work that these highly profitable companies are putting in making our research more engageable. It's like they stop at the point of access. Okay, so now it's open access for readers. That's it.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's not it. That's a good, important step, yes, but we can be used that money in much better ways.
Great. No, that's quite right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gustavo, for joining us for an excellent talk and great insights shared in response to our questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining our seminar today. Our next Global Public Seminar in Comparative International Education will take place on the 22nd of June in 1 month's time. Dr. Nachapoy Vincent Trakupadetkai-Tekavit will talk about an international survey study exploring teachers' perceptions on using mathematical storytelling, the case of England. I have also shared the link for registration in the chat. Thank you, everyone, for an excellent seminar. Goodbye for now, and hope to see you in June. Bye-bye.